Poor Vladimir Putin. The West has broken its promises not to include former USSR nations in NATO. With an economy about the size of South Korea, Russia is no match for the West, economically, militarily, or any other way. Its only hope to regain past glory is to become China's lapdog, while China, increasingly, considers sending its pup to a communist no-kill shelter. Yes, indeed, Vladimir Putin is besieged. The question is not whether he's besieged, but why. The West is corrupt. The West is decadent. The West is controlling. The West is philosophically weak. All these things are actually true. But much like the question about whether a country is capitalist or socialist, it's not a matter of labels or purity. It's a matter of behavior and degree. Would you rather live in the starving, more communist China of Mao or the prospering, more capitalist China of Deng, which is unfortunately, for the Chinese, now being dismantled by Xi? Over the past couple of decades, Mr. Putin has created a country that nobody but Russians want any part of. There's so much BS being slung around in this war by both sides it would fill the Kremlin, but there's one inescapable fact that all the equivocation in the world won't change. Increasingly, Ukrainians want to be allied with the West, not with Russia. Giving a free country free choice is not provocation, it's called progress. Putin had his chance to woo the Ukrainians and he blew it. And the reason he blew it is nobody's fault but his own. Given a choice, humans as a species will prioritize freedom every single time. And that's not to say some individual humans or even countries won't choose to live in a more restricted society for a time, but it is to say that as a species, we will always choose more freedom over less freedom. And it's not necessarily because we want to or because we realize it's the right choice. It's because we have to survive. It's the one unassailable evolutionary advantage humans have. That's the way she planned it. She didn't ask for our opinion, and she was right not to. The citizens of Mr. Putin's Russia are less free than the citizens of the nearby former Soviet bloc countries. Over there, there's less poisoning, less disappearing, less clubbing, lying, although that one's probably close, than there is in Russia. I visited Hungary about 5 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and Russia about 5 years after that. In Hungary, there were still some old Soviet statues around waiting to be dismantled. When Western tourists, unable to read the inscriptions, would ask if these were the people responsible for the great defeat of communism, the Hungarians would answer a deadpan, "Igen." They were polite, intelligent, and competent as well as hilarious. In Russia, as a general rule, dealing with any of their so-called merchants was like dealing with the post office or the DMV. Would you rather get your mail delivered by the post office or FedEx? I have sympathy for the Russians, I really do. But according to what I think is reasonably reliable polling data, Mr. Putin is popular in Russia. At least he was prior to this latest fiasco. We'll see if anything changes. But he, for the most part, is in power because people want him there. Mr. Putin has presided over a nation that, while more free than the USSR, has lagged far, far behind that of many of its former subject countries. Is it any wonder that the former subjects want more freedom, not less? The predictable result is an expanding NATO. Should we condemn these countries to eternal buffer state status because Putin is still living in 1980? Now, Mr. Putin claims that by invading Ukraine, he's actually liberating the people of Ukraine to become Russians again. On second thought, I take back what I said about lying to your people and to the world. It's not even close. Now, are the leaders in the West just as dishonest as Putin? Yeah. It's just that they can't get away with it as easily. People in the United States, for example, who think that censorship is as bad here as it is in Russia or China, they just have no idea what they're talking about. Now, I find the mostly private censorship here we are experiencing right now to be reprehensible, but the distinction between the two is very, very stark. Now, that's not to downplay the very worrisome trend, but it is to acknowledge the reality of the current facts on the ground now. Anyway, Mr. Putin says he's invading Ukraine to liberate its people. If that's the case, perhaps Mr. Putin could explain this map. It shows about 20 Ukrainian citizens choosing to flee Mr. Putin's invasion of their homeland to the west instead of into the welcoming arms of Mother Russia. Talk about voting with your feet. Now, whose fault is that? Don't tell me. Let me guess. Rule number 1 in the dictator's playbook: nothing is ever your fault. It's the decadent West. It's the treasonous opponents. It's the infidels. It's the gays. It's the Jews. If you were to put Mr. Putin's behavior in a relationship context, he'd be the crazy ex-girlfriend or the controlling boyfriend or the, it's impossible for him to conceive of a situation where anyone would choose an alternative when presented with the wonderfulness that is Vlad Putin. Forgive me as I borrow an admittedly lame platitude from the early 2000s, but it seems to fit here. Vlad, they're just not that into you.